Good morning. It's good to see many of you out here. The auditorium's looking more full each week, and so we appreciate you all being here. We also ask that you just please remember the CDC guidelines. We're still in the middle of this, so we appreciate everyone being cooperative with the mask and staying 6 feet apart or as best you can. But it's good to see you all here this morning. We're going to be continuing our theme for 2020 this year. I know it's been kind of hit and miss, but we're coming back to it, of the one another's of Christianity. And specifically this morning, we're going to be looking at comfort one another, which is taken directly from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 18, and we'll get there in just a moment. Russ and I did not coordinate whatsoever on the songs this morning, but the song I led before the lesson happens to be just very appropriate for this lesson. Because they ask the question, does Jesus care? It's talking about comfort. When we're going through our darkest of darks, we're walking through the valley of shadow of death, it feels like we are alone. It feels that way at times. And the psalm asks the question, does Jesus even care? Does he give me the time of day? Of course, the chorus answers yes, he does. But interesting enough, through God's providence, oftentimes the way Jesus shows his care to us when we are going through trials and periods of discouragement and discomfort is through other Christians. It's through God's providence, and oftentimes it's other brothers and sisters in Christ that come to us that offer that balm that we so desperately need. Because we all need comfort. I think if anything that 2020 has taught us is we all need a little comfort from time to time. Whether it's you're going through the emotional distress, psychological distress, the stress comes from being told that you're not essential, which I still don't get that. The stress of just not being able to assemble with other Christians. And we do the best we can with the virtual stuff, but I think anyone who's tuned into our live stream, myself included, can say, it's not the same. I'm glad it's there. There's some level of connection, but it's not the same. And so we all understand this need. And again, looking at these one another's, how do we become better comforters? In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 18, we read this statement that Paul writes towards the end of the 1 Thessalonian letter. In a sense, 1 and 2 say Thessalonians 5 times fast, and then there you go. In a sense, 1 and 2 Thessalonians are about comfort. These Christians were seriously concerned about their brothers and sisters who had fallen asleep in the Lord, physically died, because they had died before the return. Remember, towards the end of the first century, the big problem, first half we're dealing with how are we justified. Second half is like, okay, when's Jesus coming back? And they thought, since they died before Jesus coming back, are they going to be part of the resurrection? Do they get to get into heaven? And Paul's 1st and 2nd Thessalonian letter is all about giving that better knowledge of what's going to happen in the resurrection. And what does Paul say in the 18th verse of chapter 4? He says, therefore, comfort one another with these words. Take this knowledge I've given to you and comfort one another that, yes, they will see resurrection. They will be with the Lord, even though they died before he came back. And so we're going to use that as a springboard into this lesson, and I don't imagine it be anything too mind-blowing. Really, we want to kind of start off with what's at stake when there's no comfort. Now, we need to recognize that to comfort one another is a specific application of to encourage one another. But it's interesting that the Bible does use that phrase, comfort one another, separate from encourage one another. Kind of think of encourage as the general umbrella and comfort as a specific application underneath that umbrella. But encourage can come in different ways. It can come from just telling somebody what a good job they did on the prayer at worship, or just saying how much you appreciate somebody. Comfort is done with the intent to alleviate some sort of distress, some sort of discomfort. But what happens when there is no comfort? Turn to Hebrews chapter 4. We're going to be in verse 12, reading through verse 14. I know your text will more than likely say encourage in this section. But specifically, the idea that's carried with the use of encourage in this chapter has the idea of comfort. Hebrews chapter 3, starting verse 12. Hebrews 3, starting verse 12. It says, "Take care, brethren, that there not be any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. But encourage one another day after day, as long as it's still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For if we become partakers of Christ, for we have become partakers of Christ, if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance firm until the end." So the warning is, take care that none of you falls away. But what's the solution to make sure they don't fall away? They're encouraged. They're comforted in their distresses. But what happens when a person is left alone with their discomfort, with their doubts, left alone in the darkness? They dwell on it. You get in this negative feedback loop. This is why stuff like anxiety, depression, in a non-clinical and clinical way is very difficult to treat, because it creates this negative feedback loop. You feel awful, so you do things that make you feel more awful, so you feel bad about feeling bad, and it just feeds into each other. And unless somebody can step in and break that negative feedback loop, you're stuck. And sometimes that person is you, but oftentimes it's a trusted friend, a counselor, somebody to step in and break that. So applying this to discomfort spiritually, let's take the spiritual aspect of this. I don't think it's very hard for us to understand what happens if we get stuck in these spiritual downs and there's no one there to give us any sort of comfort. No one there to come alongside us to point out how, the blessings we still have. No one there to encourage us. No one there to spurn us on to love and good works, as the Hebrew writer would later do for the Hebrews. It almost gets insurmountable, the amount of discomfort we feel. And what happens when that discomfort is not dealt with? Back in verse 12. "There becomes an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God." So let's not saying you are or I am, but let's not minimize the comfort one another, because we are talking about life and death in some cases when it comes to comforting one another. You especially, you think of a timely death of a loved one. That's a very critical moment in a person's life. It's a very heartbreaking moment of immense sorrow, mourning, discomfort. And if they're a believer, and if it's a believing family, yes, there is some comfort there, but there is still the challenge of what are we going to do with that? Are we going to get the comfort from God and our brethren that we need? Or is there going to be, as often happens, are there going to be well-intentioned comments that just should not have been said? That's a life and death point spiritually. Physical health, when your health fails, we can go on and on. So we're going to continue down this path a little bit, and it's going to get better. I promise you of that. And sometimes to figure out how to be a better something, we need to see how not to do the thing. So turn me to the book of Job. We're going to look at Job's friends for a little bit on how not to be a comforter. And actually, there's going to be two things we learn about how to be better comforters from Job's friends, because it's what they didn't do. But we're going to focus on what they did do to begin with. So how not to be a comforter. So we can turn to the book of Job and Job 16. And if you can find the book of Psalms, in fact, actually a quick little trick, try and divide your Bible in half, and that should land you somewhere in Psalms, maybe Isaiah. If you're in Isaiah, start flipping backwards. And Job is right before the book of Psalms. So in Job 16, we're going to be reading the first 5 verses. Now, to kind of set the context, Job and Job's friends do not have the prologue to this book, chapter 1. Where Satan comes about from wandering among the earth, and he comes into the host of heaven, and he says before God, "Does Job fear you for nothing?" Basically says, well, of course Job's good. You protect him. And so Satan proposes something that God allows Satan to test Job up to the point of death. So death was the only thing he couldn't really do. And so one afternoon, Job lost everything: wife, kids, wealth, possessions, health, clothing, to where Job's friends, when they show up, he is in sackcloth and ashes, covered in sores, and just had such a level of grief and discomfort that you kind of just sit there in silence. You don't know how to respond. You're kind of tucked up in the fetal position because you don't know what to do. And Job's friends, we're going to get to this, but there's no shortage of advice that Job's friends offer to Job. All of it wrong. So we get to chapter 16, starting verse 1, and Job answers them finally. Then Job answered, I have heard many such things. Sorry comforters are you all. Some of your translations may say miserable comforters. I have a footnote in my Bible that says comforters of trouble is what his friends were. Is there no limit to windy words, or what plagues you that you answer? I too could speak like you, if I were in your place. I can compose words against you and shake my head at you. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips could lessen your pain. I'm going to give you the Brenden Ashby translation, which is going to condense these 5 verses down into one. Shut up, please. You're doing nothing good here. You're just making this whole situation worse. You guys just need to be quiet. As he's saying here, he's like, I could strengthen you in my mouth with the solace of my lips. That is, if I was quiet, I could comfort you if I was in your shoes. So what made them miserable comforters that Job just exclaims like this? In Job chapter 5, we come back here. Job chapter 5, starting verse 17. Eliphaz, we're going to read about. Now, here's the first way that Job's friends messed up. It's not that what they said was untrue. And since there are some things they said about God that's absolutely just not right, but it was misapplied. You know, like a doctor who makes a wrong primary diagnosis, all the other treatments after that, if the primary diagnosis is wrong, the treatment's going to be wrong. You know, if I treat you, if I somehow, and again, this is the reason why I'm not a doctor, if I misdiagnose you with, well, no, this happens. A friend of mine told me about this. So we have valley fever out here that almost no one else in the country has. It's a Southwest thing. So you out here, you're coughing, you're wheezing, and they take the x-rays and your lungs are all full up with liquid and everything. And the primary diagnosis out here is like, oh, you got valley fever. Here's how we treat that. Somebody caught valley fever out here, snowbird, went back east. Their doctor said, oh, no, they didn't know about valley fever. They diagnosed him with lung cancer because that's what it looked like. And they were getting ready to start chemo before their doctor out here called them and says, no, it's not cancer, it's valley fever. Now, those who have gone through cancer treatments or loved ones have gone through that, we all know the toll that chemo can take on a body. Now, imagine having to go through that knowing that that's not the right diagnosis. That's not even the right treatment. You're just going through that for the sake of going through it. That's basically what Eliphaz is doing here. He made the wrong diagnosis, and now he's applying the wrong treatment. My ranting's over on that. We're now going to read the text starting verse 17. He says, Behold, how happy is the man whom God reproves. So do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. For he inflicts pain and gives relief. He wounds and his hands also heal. Now this isn't a larger argument of God being just and stuff, but basically his argument is, well, Job, if you're suffering, it has to be because you sinned. Now, I'm not a counselor, you're not a counselor, but a very easy question. Is that the most appropriate thing to say to somebody who just lost his wife and children and everything he has and ever had owned? No. You're just rubbing salt in the wound there. And the thing is, Eliphaz isn't wrong in that truth. Jesus in the book of Revelation, chapter 3 and verse 19, to the message of the church at Laodicea there, He says, to those whom the Lord loves, he reproves and disciplines. Eliphaz isn't wrong. But he was wrong in his primary diagnosis. He presumed that Job had sinned and was doing something deserving of God's discipline. Again, he doesn't have the prologue. So he thinks it's coming from God. It's not coming from God. It's coming from Satan. So they misapplied truth. Secondly, I think we can see this, they had bad timing. In Job chapter 6, starting in verse 25, and we're going to read 25 and 26. Job continues his rebuke of them. He says, how painful are honest words. But what does your argument prove? Do you intend to reprove my words when the words of one in despair belong to the wind? Basically, Job's argument here is, now some of their rebuke, some of Job's friends' rebuke was at the words that Job was saying. And Job was saying a lot of things. Job gets to the point in the book of Job where he starts questioning God, and finally God towards the end is like, all right, sit down. I need to set the record straight because you're off base here. God doesn't fault Job for anything he said. He does correct him. But they're rebuking his words and basically saying it's the wrong timing. He basically saying what he said there in verse 26, the words of one in discomfort and despair belong to the wind. That is, they go away. The person, it's the words of a person in discomfort are symptoms of the discomfort. You know, as one writer put it, reproof, as Job's friends were doing, is salt in the wound of the soul sore problem. Because the sufferer's words are cries for relief, not statements of belief. It's what Job called wind words. Job is, these statements he's making, and we didn't cover any, but the questioning the goodness of God and why is this happening to me? He doesn't actually believe that. It's symptoms of it's him crying out in pain of the despair and comfort he's in. And Job's friends, instead of actually trying to work with him and provide real relief, their answers were, hey, Job, I know you just lost your wife and children whom you love dearly and your entire life savings, and you lost everything, but you're in the wrong. And here's why you're in the wrong. And how dare you say this? You know, his friends who are fed, clothed, still have their wife and children if they have them, still have their property, roll up on a scene like, clearly you're wrong. So what are the two lessons we learned from Job's friends? Okay, they had awful timing and misapplied truth, which revealed two necessary things that we need to be good comforters. So the first is patient ears. Job's friends started in on the attack before they even heard the whole matter. So when we're trying to comfort somebody, do not jump in immediately with your I think so's and suggestions. Most of the time, people in discomfort and distress, they just need somebody that will listen. And this is going to come up later. But we look in the book of Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 18. We're going to look at two statements here about listening to the whole matter and some wisdom here. Proverbs 18 in the verses 17. The proverb writer says, the first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. Eliphaz thought he was in the right. He comes up into a situation like, okay, Job's suffering. Well, God's just. God disciplines those who are in the wrong, so Job must be in the wrong. Again, Eliphaz didn't have the whole picture. Eliphaz didn't even wait to hear what Job was doing the day of the calamity. You go to chapter 2, when Job's children are out in their brother's home having a feast, Job is at the altar offering sacrifices for him, his wife, and his children. He's worshiping, he's doing what he's always been doing. He's making intercession for his own children and any sins they might have done. Eliphaz didn't get that part of the story. Eliphaz didn't have any of that. He just jumped right in. So be patient when we're coming to somebody. And jumping back up to verse 13. He who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him. That is, don't just jump in with your I think so's and answers before you've actually heard the whole matter, before you've weighed everything, weighed your own words in the response. And make sure you don't make, and this is a bonus point, make sure if you're going to apply the truth of Scripture, it is rightfully applied, not misapplied. Because I'll tell you what, right now, Romans chapter 8, God causes all things to work together for good to those who love Him. And that doesn't mean that every child's death was part of God's plan. That's a misapplication right there. So make sure you're using things in context, making things rightfully applied truth. That way, the Word of God is a balm, not salt in a wound. But Scripture taken out of context will be salt in a wound. So what's the second thing we learned from Job's friends? Okay, we need patient ears. Listen to the whole matter. Make sure you think before you speak. Secondly, a discerning heart. Know when to speak. Know when something needs to be said. And normally it was a Roman Stoic phrase that I think is useful here. On thinking about what is worth saying, you need to ask your question will the world be a lesser place if this is not said? Does this thing need to absolutely be said? Or is it really going to make a difference? Taking more scriptural, biblical counsel, Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6. Now, contextually, Paul is talking about dealing with outsiders and evangelism and so forth here, but the principle of verse 6 applies. Colossians 4 and verse 6, he says, "Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so you will know how to respond to each person." Our responses need to be tailored to the person. What is needed? What is appropriate? There might be an occasion for reproof. A person's calamity and discomfort might be the result of their sin in their life. But not in the midst of their distress is probably not the time to throw the book at them. Let's make an application to us when we were still sinners, outside of the grace of God and objects of His just and holy wrath. When we came to a knowledge of what Jesus did, we didn't need God telling us that we were sinners. We knew it. On the day of Pentecost, Peter didn't preach anything about them being sinners. He preached about the glory and majesty of Christ, and they interrupted Peter like, "Oh dear, we're sinners. What shall we do to be saved?" Person in the place of discomfort normally knows they've done messed up if it's because of their sins. So our job is to offer that balm. And just as God offered that through Christ, after we're in Christ, we start working on cleaning that up with the help of God. So I would say, there's a time for reproof. But in the midst of, maybe an illustration. There was one time on a Sunday evening, we had an orchard hill behind our house out in Yells Creek. Neighbor was over by the fence, as often happened. My dad's talking there with him, and I start rolling my bike out to go up the hill. And my dad goes, where are you going with that? I'm going to ride up the hill and then ride it back down. It was a pretty steep hill. And I started walking. He says, "Don't ruin my Sunday night because I'm not taking you to the hospital." And I stopped. I went, I turned back and I didn't ride it up. Now, let's say I did. Rolled it up, rode it all the way down, come crashing in, break my arm. My dad would have taken me to the hospital. But in that moment, he's not going to say, "Son, with your bones sticking out, see, you couldn't stop that. I told you so. This is your own fault." No, the immediate matter is we need to get you to the hospital, get this fixed. And then when I'm in the recovery room, then he's going to say to me, "Now, what did we learn from this?" So it is with reproof. We do the triage first. And then later, when it's appropriate, like, okay, if it is a result of sin, what do we learn from this? Like, what do we got to fix here? So those two things. So I'm going to wrap this up here. 3 ways we can be better comforters. Again, these 2 things are absolutely necessary. Patient ears, a discerning heart. Listen to the whole matter, know when to respond. So 3 practical ways I'm going to try and make application to August of 2020 and the year of the plague, how we can do some of this stuff. So the first one, show up. Just show up. I think we undervalue this sometimes. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, starting verse 9. This is towards the end of Paul's life, and he's writing to Timothy, who was like a son to Paul. The way he talks about him, the way he's proud about him. As far as we know, Paul was never married, never had children, so Timothy was the closest thing he had to flesh and blood. He calls him my dear child in the faith. And as Paul knows, he's nearing the end of his life. He says in verse 6 of chapter 4, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and my time of departure has come." Writings on the wall. My days are numbered. Jump down to verse 9. He says to Timothy, "Make every effort to come to me soon. For Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark, bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. But Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak which I left in Troas with Carpus, and the books, especially the parchments." Now I read a little bit more here, but basically Paul's painting his situation. Some of his closest companions have gone back into the world, like Demas. Others, due to the pressing matter of the gospel, could not delay him any further. They need to go to their places where they're going to preach and establish churches and convert souls. And so who does he have left? He has Luke, who's been with him since the middle of the book of Acts. But who does he want most in his final days? He wants Luke, his son, and John Mark, who apparently by this point, they have mended their dispute that happened early in the book of Acts. And now Mark is not quite like Timothy, but pretty close. He wants those 2 people in his final days. Not to bring money, not to do anything. He just wants to be with them. There's a motivational speaker who told this story, and I think it's appropriate here. He's a father. His son has special needs. And I think any of us can understand high school in general is just awful. Teenagers, they're scary creatures. I say that because I was one. And it didn't cross this kid's parents' minds that how could a kid be lonely in a school of 2,000 kids and probably 200 and 250 teachers? Until freshman year, high school, it's Halloween. He's up in his room, wants to go trick-or-treating, but parents ask to take him and says no, he doesn't want his parents, and he has no one to go with. And you can imagine with each knock on the door, each doorbell ring, hearing other kids come, that the loneliness just sunk in deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Until 2 kids show up at the end of the driveway. No one provoked them, no one motivated them, no one asked them to, no one paid them to. They showed up, said, "Can you come trick-or-treating with us?" Unprovoked. All they did was show up. And that changed that kid's entire night, entire probably high school experience. So making applications for us, how can we show up today? Again, we all don't like the socially distant thing, but we do it for love of the brethren. You might find the mask annoying, but we do it for the love of brethren or fellow man. But there's still ways we can reach out and we can just show up. We have a lot of shut-ins right now. Maybe you just take it upon yourself, pick 2 or 3 or just pick one that you're going to adopt. And you're going to call and check in with them at least once a week and just chat for a little bit. Maybe you don't like doing the phone calls. Well, you can do a driveway visit. You just stand at the end of the driveway. You can talk for a little bit. Write cards. Send text. Whatever you do to stay in contact with people. It doesn't have to be long. 5, 10 minutes. but just let them know that you're there. Show up. And comfort those who are living isolated lives more now than ever, especially our widows and widowers and people living by themselves. Loneliness is a very dangerous condition, mentally, spiritually. That's why God places in communities of believers, not being isolated Christians out in the wilderness. So just show up. Secondly, if able, lift. In Galatians chapter 6, in verse 2. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2, Paul says, bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. Now, I think we've dealt with this in kind of an encouraging thing, but discomfort and giving comfort is a way to help bear up somebody's burdens. This is the burden of loneliness or being removed or cut off. We're going to look at a specific way to bear on this, and it's specific to Paul, but I think we can make some applications from here. Now, just as Christ came to be the ultimate burden bearer, he took our burden of sin, and we fulfill the law of Christ when we do this. And we take on the character of God because God himself in Psalm 55 verse 22 talks about casting all your burdens upon him. He is a burden bearer. And that's what we're called to be. Now in Philippians chapter 4, starting verse 10, we're going to read about the Philippians' gift that they sent to Paul. Philippians 4, starting verse 10, he says, but I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at least you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I ask from want, for I have learned to be content with whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along in humble means. I also know how to live in prosperity. And in any circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having need and suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Nevertheless, you have done well to share with me in my affliction. Now, Paul is one of those people that you cannot compliment. Paul's one of those people that you just can't. Because he'll start thanking you for something, and immediately, as we all should, he turns it back to the glory of God in Christ. So he thanks them for the gift, and this is as much of a thank you we're going to get from Paul. He thanks them for the gift in verse 10 and verse 14. But in that, it's like, I know how to get along with whatever means I am. You know, Christ is the one who sustains me, who strengthens me. But within this, we can perhaps read in a little bit, but we can see that Paul has a great relief that this gift was sent. It's anyone who has preached in any capacity of full-time or supported or unsupported, or anyone who has lost income. Let's just do that. Anyone who's lost income or the budget's been tight, there's been hours cut, job cut, whatever. I think we can all understand the stress of having too much month at the end of our money, of just not having enough. And what kind of relief it would be for Paul and for any of us if somebody came along and said, hey, your groceries for next month, I'm covering that. That's a stressor off my plate. For Paul, we know that Paul was a tent maker. In Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 3, he talks about Aquila and Priscilla, how they were same trade as he was, and he worked together with them. But Paul couldn't devote himself completely to preaching the word. He had to work his day job. And there's this kind of conflict within him. But as soon as Timothy and some others show up, it's like, great, I can preach full time now. I don't have to worry about the stress of providing for myself. Others are graciously doing that for me, so I can give more to the Lord. So applying this, especially right now, if I am able to somehow lift somebody else's burden, financially, maybe, can't get out and do the chores right now in the yard, I can volunteer my time, whatever it may be, I can relieve, if I'm able, I can relieve that stress. And it's just something off that person's plate that they don't have to worry about anymore. Because if anyone, I mean, it's like finding an extra $50 in your pocket when you've run out of money. Like, great. You feel kind of great about that. You have a little bit more to buy groceries and stuff. It applies in many other places as well. And the third way is be an example, especially right now. And I've tried to tailor these to right now, again, 2020. It can be a great comfort to many Christians who are shut in, older Christians, by just seeing other Christians being the best Christian they can be. Growing up, small congregation I grew up in, again, the building stopped at the 7th pew. So you could fit an auditorium like 4 times over in this auditorium. There's a brother by the name of T. Kent. He's since gone on to his reward. The guy, I think, was 96 when he passed. He had severe neuropathy and leg pain and everything else. He couldn't do anything when I met him. He showed up, sat in the 2nd pew, and sat there. He's a guy that didn't have much education. He taught himself to read by reading the King James Bible. He couldn't lead singing. He couldn't be an elder anymore, none of that. But it brought him such great joy and comfort when he saw the young people, and he would define young people as 50 and under. But when he saw them faithfully coming every week, of participating in the Bible classes, eventually teaching the Bible classes, of growing, of just being the Christians they ought to be, it made him feel a little bit more secure. In the sense that, as many older Christians feel, when health fails, I can't do the things I used to. But it can be comforting to see the next generation step up, so there's no longer this burden feeling of guilt of like, if there's no one else to do this, so I need to do this. Unfortunately, there are some men preaching today who have been preaching 20, 30 years longer than they ever planned to because there's no one there to step up and fill the gap. There are older Christians who, T did this. He led singing one night. It took him about 10 minutes to walk up, and he had to prop himself up against the Lord's table with his cane because there's no one else there to do it. It's a great comfort to older Christians when there's young people to fill those gaps, when the next generation of the church is coming to maturity. This is an area where the younger generation can really be a comfort to the older. But in general, peer-to-peer, not just older to younger, younger to older, but just peer-to-peer. It is a comfort to see people in your same age group, people you know well, just being the Christians, being the best Christian they can be. Because when we get in our periods of trial and tribulation and temptation and discomfort, we can look to them for support and strength. If they can do it, I can do it. It's when I visited a congregation in Memphis, talking to some of the people there, and a lot of them, I believe it's Freed-Hardeman University is there in Memphis with their med school. A lot of them are, either RN students or medical students. There was one of the man in the congregation. He was an anesthesiologist, long hours. He was there every service, actively participating, actively teaching Bible classes, sometimes after like a 14-hour shift. And the comment that was made by some of the young people I was around was, when I feel like I don't want to go after a long day of labs and testing, I look at him, who's just gotten off a 12-hour, 14-hour shift at the hospital, still shows up. I'm like, nah, I don't have an excuse. I'm going to show up. Just being a Christian to the best of your ability is a great comfort. So I hope this week we can resolve to be better comforters. I want us to maybe jot something down right now. One way that we can be a comfort to somebody else in this congregation today or this week. And you're visiting with us, still do this. Think of somebody in your home congregation or somebody you can reach out to this week and be a comfort. And might suggest if you've never done this before, just start with a phone call. Pick somebody on the list, who's because of health or age or somebody that hasn't been able to assemble with us this whole time. Write down their name and make it a priority. Just talk with them this week. Tell them, be honest about it. Tell them how much you appreciate them, how much you value them. And you know what the funny thing is? If all of us resolve to do that, everyone gets covered. No one falls through the gaps. Now, we're called to be comforters because God himself is a God of comfort. Paul said this much in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 3, the God of all comfort there. He is a God of all comfort because not only does he give balm and comfort to those of his children who are sick and ailing and dealing with trials, as we sang about before the lesson. He's also the God of comfort because he gave his Son to solve the ultimate discomfort in our lives, the problem of sin. If you're here this morning, you recognize you're a sinner. You haven't been living life to the best of your ability. You know that you're not in the right relationship with God. Jesus made it very simple for us. By dying on the cross, he made the floodgates open of grace. And that all those who would crucify their lives with him, be buried with him, united with him in the waters of baptism, to be raised up to walk in newness of life, they can experience the transformative power of God. And if you've done that in the past and you're not living right, you have sins that need confessing, you need prayers of strength and encouragement, this is your time to seek that. So whatever your need, if you're subject to the invitation, please come forward as we stand and sing the song of invitation.